Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. We're going to have a great conversation today with James Baird, author of King of Kings, a recent political work written by a pastor. And it's receiving lots of accolades and reviews online. So I wanted to talk with him and get into some topics he hasn't explored yet regarding religious liberty and these kinds of matters. So we're going to have a great conversation there. Before we get into that, I want to remind you about a product that I use from ionlayer.com. These are medical grade patches that help your NAD plus levels. NAD plus is essential to your mitochondrial health, helps boost your immunity, your mental health, your recovery after a workout. You need NAD plus levels because as you age, those NAD plus levels decline. These are medical grade patches, not an IV. You get a meeting with a doctor. They go over all that kind of stuff. Very professional over at Ion Layer. Use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. These kits are already affordable, and they're definitely going to help you. And if they don't, there's a money-back guarantee. But regardless, head over to ionlayer.com. Use code FPT to get $100 off your first kit. As always, you can sign up on the Patreon and the link in the show notes. Get early access to every episode. Head over to Chase Davis for all my latest writing. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into the conversation with James Baird. So we are discussing your book, King of Kings. I guess before we get into that, for those who don't know, tell the audience about yourself for those who are unfamiliar with your work.
Yeah, so I'm a grad of Covenant College. It's the PCA's college, Presbyterian Church in America. Went off to Westminster Seminary, did in Philadelphia, did my THM with a guy named Robert Letham. Some people may know him. And I'm currently the pastor of Christian education at Covenant Church of Naples in South Florida.
Excellent. What years were you at Westminster?
Let's see here. I was there on campus 2015 to 2018. And then I worked remotely for a number of years after that.
That's great. Yeah, it's funny. I wanted to go to Westminster because my THM thesis was on John Frame. And I was trained at Denver Seminary, so I kind of knew Denver Seminary was a more affordable. Yeah. Westminster is like very famous, prestigious, or at least it is, in some evangelical circles. They sent me like a Great New Testament with my name on it, a pin.
Yep.
And so I really wanted to go, but I didn't end up going. But that's awesome that you got to go there and study under Letham. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, that's what I did my THM at Union School of Theology. So if you know, like Michael Reeves.
Yes, of course.
So yeah, that's how I got connected with Letham.
Excellent. That's great. And what was your THM on?
I did it on Augustine.
Oh.
So Augustine. Yeah, I did it on Augustine and his religious psychology. So it was fun.
Very fun. That's great. Well, man, I would love to have you back on to talk about that sometime too, because wonderful, wonderful stuff that he writes. In your book, you intro it, and I really appreciated your candor in the book because you kind of introduced it by saying you're writing the book to yourself a few years ago. And I was curious to pull that thread a little bit. What does that mean? Like what was going on a few years ago? Who were you listening to? What were you believing? Where you would have read this book now and either would have taken offense or, needed to be swayed away from?
I think on political questions, my diet probably looks like every pastor's did. Reading a lot of TGC, Desiring God. That was kind of the source where they were at least cranking out material on these topics. And most of my academic study was on, other topics like doctrine of God, doctrine of revelation. But then after 2020, I think all of us realized we needed to bone up on our political theology. And when I was looking to become ordained, I wanted to have a principled way to shepherd my people around these questions. So I just went back to Calvin and Turretin and Bavinck and all the guys we love, and I started reading those sections of their works that we skip in seminary, like book 4 of Calvin's Institutes. And man, my mind was blown because not only did their reasoning make a lot more sense than other things that I'd heard, the caricatures that I'd heard of them, I realized just weren't true. And I started getting excited about it and sharing it with other pastors. And I thought, hey, how can I kind of summarize all of these things that changed my mind and hand it out to other people as well? So that's the origin story.
That's wonderful. And I think it's a great accessible work. I'll put a link in the show notes for listeners. Go pick it up. It's a really simple read, and that's not diminishing the work you did. It's robust, but it's quick in that you can read through it. You can comprehend the concepts easily. It's transparent, just really well written. So lots of respect there. To kind of let the cat out of the bag right up front in your book, you say what do I mean when I say government must promote Christianity as the only true religion? That's kind of your
Hmm.
statement. You back that up throughout the book. That government must promote Christianity as the only true religion. We'll get into like qualms people would have with that statement, but you say each word is important, and so we need to unpack them. So I wanted to have you kind of unpack that since it is kind of your general idea in the book for the audience here on our
Yep.
podcast.
Yep. One move I decided to make in the book is just say the scary thing up front. You
Smart.
don't get to the end and you're like, oh, it's like, no, no, no. This may freak you out. It would have freaked me out, but I think it's true. I think it's good. And so here's what I mean by that's my thesis statement, right? So when I say government, I'm referring to all civil officials in every level of government. If you have a government position, then you need to be promoting true religion or promoting Christianity as the only true religion. Now, we also have to take into effect that what it means to be a mayor versus a sheriff versus a city manager. You have different duties, you have different limits on what you're allowed to do. So you always need to factor that in, right? It doesn't mean that promoting Christianity looks the same for everyone. It just means everyone has the same basic duty. So I mean, anyone in a civil position, that's who I'm talking about. By must, I'm referring to technically it's called a deontological duty, right? It's like don't murder people. It's not try not to, don't do it if you can help it, or man, it would be really nice if you didn't murder people. No, it's an absolute duty. You must do this thing. Now, again, depending on the context, that may look a whole lot differently for you. So another deontological duty would be honor your father and mother. Well, if you have parents who have made a lot of bad life choices, they have severe mental illness problems, how you honor your father and mother will look way differently than a kid who comes from a stable household. So, just by saying everyone in government has this absolute duty, that doesn't mean that it doesn't take different forms depending on your circumstance. But hey, the kid with parents who are in a really bad spot and a kid with awesome parents, both of them have the same basic duty. It just looks differently for them. So that's what I mean by must. By promote, I mean anything that would advance or support or encourage or protect and defend Christianity. I picked a broad term to try and capture again the fact that this absolute duty does look differently depending on the circumstances. But you could think about how um, a professor may promote an idea in class by arguing for it. I say this in the book. Or an advertising agency may promote a new product by advertising it. There, you may promote a good behavior amongst your kids by rewarding it with a popsicle. We're in South Florida, so popsicles are a year-round treat. So promote is a very broad term. It captures the complexity that may be involved, but it has this idea that you're supposed to, we could put it this way: the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ should be very glad you're in office. That's kind of the idea there. The next word is Christianity. And what I mean by Christianity is Orthodox, Protestant Christianity with all of its different flavors. The Westminster Confession of Faith, the confessional documents of my church, uses the phrase the Church of our common Lord without giving preference to any particular sect. So we're not arguing for a Presbyterian government or Baptist government or, Methodist government, arguing for a Christian government. And I can unpack that further. So that's what I mean by Christianity. And then, as the only true religion, it's a very simple claim. There's only one true religion. Christianity is an exclusive faith. If Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God come down, every other religion is false. And so Christianity can't just be promoted as one among many equal religions. If you're going to truly promote the Christian faith, you must do that with all of its exclusive claims. So that's what my thesis means.
That's excellent. That gives us plenty to discuss because I can already sense, maybe not my podcast audience, but those who may venture upon this podcast
Hmm.
would have some qualms, problems, or
Hmm.
concerns about even what we've talked about thus far. But you get
Yep.
into a syllogism. Now, I want to ask about syllogisms. I want to explain them to
Hmm.
people because syllogisms were very well known way of reasoning to our
Hmm.
forefathers, to many
Hmm.
Protestant reformers, but they've fallen out of favor. And they're not very used very much. Like you would, it would be maybe you do this if you preach, but most preachers aren't going to use a syllogism when they
Hmm.
preach or write. And so let's start with what is a syllogism, and let's
Hmm.
get into the syllogism you use. So, what is a syllogism? Let's start there.
So a syllogism is a simple way to format an argument.
Okay.
The reason why you want a simple, standardized way to formulate an argument is that it makes it much easier to evaluate what's actually being claimed. So if you don't analyze arguments with syllogisms, the problem is you're not exactly sure what someone is trying to say, and you're not exactly sure how to evaluate whether or not it's true. And the great thing about a syllogism, I see it as a service to people, by being very specific and saying, "This is my argument." You can look at all of its critical pieces, every critical step, so that if you disagree, you know what you're disagreeing with. So I see a syllogism as an act of service to people. To if my book's not true, people shouldn't believe it. I want them to be able to test it and prod it and question it so that they know if it's true for themselves. So a syllogism is a very ancient way of structuring an argument. We go all the way back to Plato. The famous one is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. And the way it works is that if you've constructed it well, then the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. So if you don't like the conclusion, you have to disprove one of the two premises. You have to do
Okay.
it. Now, I know that people don't like syllogisms because they might say, "Oh, it's Greek, Greek philosophy. It's pagan. It's secular." Here's what I would ask you to do: go back and read all of your favorite theologians, and just look at the fact that they're all using syllogisms.
Right.
Right. This is the reason why the Greeks knew how to do a syllogism is because they're human. They're made in God's image. God gave them the ability to reason. And so they're able to look at natural revelation and understand how logic and reasoning works. And if it's true, all truth is God's truth. We should use it. And after thousands of years of Christian history, we've seen this is not only true, it's very useful, and it can be an act of service to people who are in conversation with us.
That's excellent. Okay, so let's then get into, and I think that's really helpful. Hopefully, I've played with syllogisms, and it can just be a fun way of having robust debates with other guys on
Yep,
silly topics and serious topics.
that's right.
You can make some fun ones, but it does. I view it as an act of service as well, to because it puts your kind of cards on the table and what the principles you're arguing from. But let's get into the syllogism you wrote in your book. Can you kind of recount that and unpack it for the listener?
So the first premise is that government must promote the public good. The second premise is Christianity is an essential part of the public good. And then the conclusion naturally follows that government must therefore promote Christianity. So if you don't like that conclusion, you don't think government should promote Christianity, then you need to deny one of the other two premises. Otherwise, it follows logically. And I think it's important to realize that even if we don't like something, if it's true, we must believe it. That's how
Yeah.
God made the world.
Yep.
It's James Anderson, who's an excellent philosopher at RTS Charlotte, Reformed Theological Seminary Charlotte. He wrote a great foreword to the book. And one thing that he says is we have to put our emotions to the side for a second, and we just have to ask ourselves, are these premises true?
Right.
Because if they're true, then we have to believe the conclusion. So, some reasons why I think the two premises are true. The first one is government must promote the public good. This is a stable feature of the Western legal and philosophical tradition. It's been around for it's sort of the foundation of how we think about law and government. The Cicero famously said that the welfare of the people is the highest law. You have to, and if you have a law that is not serving the common interests of the people, it's a bad law. Even see this same thinking with the Apostle Paul in Romans 13, where he says that governing authorities are God's servant for your good. You see it in, I think it's even, I believe that it's in the 1689 London Baptist Confession, that God made government for the public good. It's certainly in the Westminster Confession. It's in the preamble to the Constitution that this form of government was for the general welfare of the people. The basic idea is government isn't there to serve itself, the government officials, or any select group of people to give them something that's privately good for them, but not everyone else. The government is there to promote the welfare of the whole community. That's the first premise. If
Okay,
you deny,
I
go
have a
ahead.
question on this one because I think like I'm given over to agree with the premise. I believe it to be
Mhm,
true, but I do sense there could be some weaknesses, and so I want to unpack maybe
mhm,
some attacks. So one would be, there are some in a more libertarian theonomic, and for the podcast listener, they're generally going to know what that means. I think you know what I mean, but
mhm,
just generally people who hear those kind of historical statements or public
mhm,
good and
mhm,
they're like, it's not necessarily the government's job. So, in the
mm,
extreme example, we've
mhm,
got this guy who, by the time this releases, I assume he's going to be mayor. I hope he's
mhm.
not, but Mamdani up in New York City
Yep.
seems to be some kind of socialist, whatever.
Mhm,
But he would and they would argue that, all of the things that he wants are public goods, right? Food,
mhm,
housing, all that kind of stuff. And
mhm,
so, is it important that we define public good either narrowly or broadly? Because in the worst cases, I think I've been accused of this randomly, kind of
mhm,
drive-by accusations of being a
yeah,
statist, which I've been like, what does that even mean? It's people that are very concerned about an expansive federal government that gets
mhm,
into way too many things that's none of their business. How would you
mhm.
address someone that has that concern with your first premise?
It's a fabulous question. The first thing I would note is how libertarians, I mean, any of us who are conservative and think these policies shouldn't be passed, how do we actually argue against them? We don't just say government shouldn't do that. What we normally say is government shouldn't do that because look at all the bad stuff that would happen. The argument against it is this does not serve the public good. It does not serve the common good. Look at all the knock-on effects, the way it the maybe the moral denigration of people who aren't working for themselves, how it's going to create an inefficient healthcare market, how it's, we point so the reason that you shouldn't agree with sort of statist communist proposals is it's bad for the country.
Right.
It will do bad things for us. So it does not entail these sort of socialist collectivist policies. It entails the government should do what it can to make sure the people are flourishing. And these sort of crazy policies do the exact opposite. So just because we say that the government must promote the public good, that does not mean the government should get involved in every nook and cranny of society, because that's oftentimes the exact opposite of what's best.
Okay. So then we get into the second premise.
Mhm.
Christianity is part of the public good. Is that the way you phrase it?
Yep, it's part of the public good. Really, my point in that chapter is an essential part of the public good. It's not a nice to have. Um,
Yeah. So why does the government then, if Christianity, because like I think the way many or some
mhm,
Christians or non-Christians might see it is like government is about kind of material concerns. The
mhm,
church is about, and you see this in radical two kingdoms theology,
mhm,
whether it's Scott Clark or others.
mhm,
It's really not any business of the government to get, or for Christianity even to get
mhm.
involved with the public good. Those are political, worldly matters.
Yep.
Um, so how do you argue that Christianity is part of the public good then?
So there's two ways to go about this, and I present both arguments in my book. The first one is let's just grant, for I don't think it's true, but let's grant for a moment that the government is only in charge of our material welfare, not our spiritual welfare. Well, okay, then let's look at the research. What best promotes the material welfare of people? And if you look at the social science, the evidence is overwhelming that Christianity is better for sort of civil welfare than any other alternative, not just any other religiously shaped government, but any other secular or neutrally shaped government. So I have a footnote in one of my chapters where I look at a number of studies that together analyze 1.5 million different people. And what they found is that Christianity is correlated with stronger economies, better education, better health care, more care and concern for others, more generosity, more environmental care, more democratic values, less delinquency, less crime, less violence, less corruption, and more. So even if you say, okay, government shouldn't be worried about your spiritual welfare, I'd say, well, should they be worried about that stuff like healthcare and education and democratic values and crime rates and delinquency rates? The government should promote Christianity. So even if you grant the premise, my argument still holds. I still think that's wrong, though. I mean, if you're a Christian, think about what it would mean if you said, when you serve in the civil government, you cannot be concerned in your official capacity for the souls of your people.
Right.
What does that entail? It entails no Christian should be ever permitted to serve in government.
Right.
How could you ever accept a job as a Christian where you're not allowed to do things that are good for the souls of others? That is positively anti-Christian.
Right.
Isn't it just obvious on the fundamental principles of what we're taught in the Bible that every person, especially every believer, but every person should be laboring that the people around them come to know Jesus and live godly lives? Why? Because it's good for them. Because Christianity is a public good. There's not a single person Christianity is bad for. It's
That's so
good
true.
for everyone. So, yeah, I think the second premise holds.
Yeah, the way I've put it, without using a syllogism, is more speaking like rhetorically, and it's I say it this way because one of my friends, Brian Brown, Pastor Brian Brown, Trinity Church, Denver, posited it to me this way. I'm sure he might have borrowed it from someone else, but he preached at our church one time, and he said, "Don't you want the world to be more Christian? You're a Christian. Don't you want the world to be more Christian?" And
Yep.
it was like a rock in my shoe at the time
Mhm.
'cause, like, I was like, "Wait, yes, I do.
Mhm.
I want more people
Yep.
to become Christian." Uh,
Yep.
uh-oh. Like,
Uh-oh.
that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
challenges a lot of, it
Yep.
revealed a heart of mine that
Mhm.
was somewhat, inconsistent
Mhm.
and really not honest about
Mhm.
how we wanted Christianity. We want the glory of the Lord to fill the earth. We want the
Yep.
promotion of Christianity. And all of a sudden, once it's kind of like a domino that falls. Once you like accept that, however you
Mhm.
want to apply that premise or that rhetorical question,
Yep.
all of a sudden it opens up the imagination and be like, well, what would the world look like? And
Mhm.
and when we
Mhm.
pray that
Mhm.
God's will would
Mhm.
be done on earth as it is in heaven, and that
Yep.
heaven is um, this uh this perfect
Yep.
dominion of
Yep.
righteousness, and we want that perfect dominion of righteousness to have an impact and shape
Mhm.
the
That's right.
contours and the applications in our world. Well, that's Christianity. We're
Yep.
not talking about totalitarianism. We're not talking about some like boogeyman
Right.
out there. We're just talking about basic mom and
Yep.
pop American apple pie Christianity. And so now you could get into dangerous waters, but it opens up a lot of fun conversations you can have with people.
Right.
Let's
That's
get
right.
into the conclusion though. Remind me again of
Sure.
your conclusion from these two premises.
Government must promote Christianity as the only true religion.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So I would love to see more
Mhm.
reviewers pick these apart. I think the question I asked is probably going to be one that other people are asking, and so it'd be very fun. Have any reviewers
Mm.
engaged this syllogism
Mhm.
in that way, like trying to break down your arguments?
Mhm. Yeah, I've seen a number of different reviewers do it. I mean, Andrew Walker, who he praised the book, but he also expressed some of his disagreements. I'd say there's a few things that I want to kind of clarify from him, but other people too. The first one is this is not an argument for a state church, right? The conclusion is not, therefore, the government must establish a national church
Right.
and, every American has to go to it. No, that's very un American. That we should talk about religious liberty later,
Yeah.
but, and we'll talk about what the First Amendment doesn't mean. But one thing that the First Amendment does mean is that Congress cannot create an established national church. That's not what we're talking about. What are we talking about here? Godly laws. Godly laws. Laws that make it easier to be godly in America and hard to be sinful. That's what we mean, right? We mean that the president of the United States is a Christian and acts like a Christian and talks about how great Christianity is and how he wishes everyone would learn the ways of Jesus, just like George Washington,
Right.
right? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about how we used to set up towns. I think zoning laws are way underappreciated as a massive, massive tool to hold high the banner of Jesus Christ. How'd it used to be? You go into a town, what's in the center of the town? A church. What is the tallest thing in town? A church. On Sunday morning, what do you hear? Church bells. This is just ways of shaping our environment, right? That pull people to Jesus. They're not forcing you to go to church. They're not going to lock you up in jail because you didn't baptize your kid. A lot of Baptists are worried about that. No, what are they doing? They're constructing space to invite people in. Or think about like what the presidents in Congress, especially during the Revolutionary War, but way after, they would call for national days of fasting and Thanksgiving. That's really where Thanksgiving comes from, to repent of our sins and thank God for blessing our nation. Did they force you to go to church? No. Did they shut down businesses so you had nothing better to do? Yes. So you don't have to be compelling people to do this. You're constructing godly laws. You're organizing space in a godly way. You're organizing time in a godly way. And there's no like gunpoint conversions or something like that. It's that the government is acting like Jesus really rose from the dead and that matters for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that the last point you said, being converted at the point of a sword, that's
Yeah.
it's a trope that's brought out all the time. And
Yep.
at the end of the day, if we're faithful Christians, and I know you and I would line up on soteriological matters in general,
Hmm.
um, no one gets converted that way. It's God
Hmm.
who saves,
That's
and
right.
people don't get converted by force. They get
That's right.
converted by the grace of God, and so it's God who
Yep.
saves the soul. All that can happen is we can set up, conditions in order to
Exactly.
either disincentivize or incentivize that,
That's
and
right.
that's why I appreciate the principled arguments because I think a lot of the boogeymans that are brought out. I remember this question coming to me when I was talking about this stuff a few years ago. They're like, "Well, would you make everyone go to church?" I'm like, look, we're drifting from the principles, and it seems like we don't even agree on the principle. Let's argue from the principles, and
Right.
then we can argue about blue laws and Sabbath laws and that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
What I
Yeah.
think it would be great if every business was like Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A, all that kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But I also, understand the complexity of the modern world. It's not like I'm
That's right.
operating in a silo here. So the application is important. One of the things that also hangs up Christians, which I appreciated you getting into in your book, is
Mhm.
Old Testament rulers and New Testament prescriptions. This hangs
Yes.
up Christians because I think a lot of Christians function as kind of Marcionites, where they view
Yeah.
the Old Testament very particularly for a particular people. And because the new covenant has come,
Mhm.
basically, in the worst cases, the
Mhm.
Old Testament really doesn't inform our faith. In the
Mhm.
best cases, it was limited in a
Mm.
particular way
Mhm.
that the New Testament maybe doesn't overturn, but does because it's a new covenant. So can you kind of walk us through the Old Testament a little bit, and then
Yeah.
talk about how the New Testament is not inharmonious with the Old Testament
Mhm.
in terms of how it views
Yep.
government?
Yep. It's been very popular in evangelicalism to deride the way that our forefathers used the Old Testament around political questions. And we're supposed to think, oh, they're so benighted. They didn't understand the Old Testament well. They didn't understand biblical theology. And now we really know. And, saying that America was a shining city on a hill. America is not Israel. These sorts of things. These guys didn't think America was the new Israel. That's not what's going on there, right? They did think the Old Testament was relevant to questions about how we live as a society, just as it's relevant to how we live as individuals, right? I think it's helpful. I did a video on this recently to realize that in the Old Testament, when you're reading an Old Testament text, especially the Old Testament law, there are three different things, at least three different things going on. One is that you see a natural moral principle at play. So one of those is the fifth commandment, right? Honor your father and mother. That's a natural moral principle built into the nature of humanity, right? Then you will see a civil law that was designed by God for that particular time and place to help that society flourish and follow that law. So a very extreme one in the Old Testament is if you have a child, and this it's like not like a 6-year-old, right? We might say like a 17-year-old. You have a child, 17 years old, super rebellious, causing huge problems around town, getting drunk, shooting into the sky, won't listen to his parents, dishonors his parents. That person should be brought by his parents to the authorities, and that child deserves the death penalty, right? Now, here's the question. Does that mean that we as Christians today need to have the death penalty for super rebellious 17-year-olds? No, that was for them. It's not for us. That law has passed away. Is there something there for us to learn? Yes. What you should learn from that is super rebellious young people are detrimental to the whole society. So you should do something rather severe to mitigate that societal risk, right? God said the death penalty. Maybe that's a bad idea today, but you should do something. There's wisdom to learn. So you have the natural principle, honor your father and mother. You learn wisdom about how to make decisions as a society when that is followed or broken. And then you also have the typological. So this is a beautiful law that points us to Christ. Who are we? God's rebellious children. Who is Christ? God's obedient son in whom he's well pleased. And the obedient son in whom God is well pleased comes and dies the death the rebellious children deserved. So what people will oftentimes do is say, oh, there's nothing we can learn here because that was for Israel, and all we can really learn is this points us to Christ. No, it points us to Christ, it gives us wisdom, and we learn the natural moral duties required by all people. So we can do the same thing with government. So we can look at the kings of Israel like David, Josiah, Hezekiah, and they do various things to promote true religion amongst the Israelites. You got to remember, there's a moral, there is a principle of application, and then there is typology. Okay. Yes, David, Hezekiah, Josiah, they all point us to Christ. Yes, they made decisions that made sense to them that may not make sense today, but let's learn from why they made those choices. And let's not forget there's still a natural moral duty that sits behind all of those particulars. So yeah, you should not say, hey, well, let's go, we have to renew the covenant just like Josiah. Well, probably not, but hey, should your government officials find some way to promote true religion that's nice and that's good for your context? Absolutely. So that's yeah.
I have so many questions that just come up all the time. One of the kind of gotchas that you'll get, especially in a more liberal context when you're trying to do evangelism, is what about shellfish, James? What about shellfish?
Yeah.
What is the natural, what is the moral, and what is the typological with the prohibition to eat certain types of food?
Yeah.
So how would you respond to that, James?
That's a great one. So the natural law behind shellfish is do what God says. If God says do something, you do it, even if you don't know why. Isn't that the point of the garden, right? Nothing's wrong with the fruit. It's not poisonous, doesn't smell bad, doesn't look nasty, right? But God said don't eat it, so don't eat it. So if God says don't eat shellfish, don't eat shellfish. That applies all the time, right? Prudentially, we know this is kind of set up in God's timing to have the Israelites separate themselves from the customs of the people around them, right? And typologically, this ultimately points to what is the special thing that we eat?
The bread and wine.
The bread and wine. So it points us forward to Christians now have a different diet than everyone else. We feel set apart. So even there, right, we see the natural, we see the stuff for that particular circumstance, and we see how it points us to Jesus.
Okay, that's great. One of the things, I don't know if you got into it in your book, I can't remember, but it's interesting because the topic of, I kind of grew up under auspices. I don't think it was said. And the view of either America or the Republican Party was communicated, maybe ham-fistedly that America is a type of new Israel. And they were pulling from the city on the hill. And I spurned a lot of that. And then I got into a lot of the reformers, especially the English reformers. And they often talked about England being in covenant with God. Do you get into this in the book, or did you find anything on the research? Because this question comes up for me a lot, at least in my mind, not with other people, is like, under what circumstances are nations today Whether
Mhm.
you want to define nations by how they are today with national
Mhm.
borders and sovereignty, nation states, or
Mhm.
ethnicity and culture, whatever it is,
Mhm.
how are nations today obligated to promote the true religion? What happens if they don't? In what way are they supposed to? Is this something that comes up in the book, or is this
No,
outside of
but
the
we can
scope?
no, we can talk about it though. So, the first thing that I like to do is not talk about whether or not nations should covenant with God, because I don't think that it is the crux of the issue.
Okay.
So, whether or not you think that a nation like America or England can, or Scotland especially, can enter into a covenant with God, does not bear upon the fact of whether or not the government should promote true religion,
Okay.
because that duty is part of God's natural moral law. It's the way he designed government. Now, some people argue that yes, government must promote true religion, and the way they ought to do that is entering into a covenant. And that's kind of an intramural debate, I think, there.
That makes sense.
But, but when you look at the Americans, let's say, even in the 19th century, it was like 200 years after the early stuff, you still have, in fact, it's a critical piece as to why George Washington's always talking about providence. Why? Because whether or not you're in a covenant with God, we know one thing. He blesses obedience and he brings judgment upon disobedience. So you should not expect God's blessing and you should expect God's judgment if you have a wicked, vile government over a wicked and vile people. God will not, you can look at Nineveh, you can look at Sodom and Gomorrah. God will not turn a blind eye to that at all. That is regardless of whether or not you're in a covenant with him. This is just how God governs people generally. So that principle is still at work, whatever your position on covenanting may be. Um,
Okay, that's
yep.
helpful. One thing that's curious to me and has been curious to me is like on the more, let's say, conservative side, just for
Mhm.
sake of argument, there is kind of this sentiment of, and I think there's something there, this patriotic, America is a city on a hill. This is in our
Mhm.
our heritage, and so
Mhm.
there is a temptation to equate America or the Western project with kind of this
Mhm.
Israel. So you get that on one hand, then you
Mhm.
get the people that hate that, and they
Mhm.
basically conclude America's Babylon. Uh,
Yep.
and what's ironic about that accusation is they hate when Christians use the Old Testament, but they use the
Mhm.
Old Testament all the
Oh yeah,
time,
that's
just
right.
in the opposite way to disparage our heritage and disparage what we're about as
Right.
Christians.
Mhm.
And so that's interesting. But they use New Testament verses,
Mhm.
especially on the left, and so they'll use things like exiles and sojourners. Well,
Mhm.
what does that mean? I mean that means we're in
Mhm.
Babylon. That means we're exiles here. So
Mhm.
we shouldn't promote the true religion,
Mhm.
doesn't it? I mean, how could we as sojourners and exiles ever imagine that position ever changing and
Mhm.
that we should promote the true religion? So how would you answer that objection?
Mhm. Mhm. I want to go back. I think it's helpful to go back to the first thing you said about in what sense is America Israel? The way that the early Americans, really, this is just the Protestant tradition, would use the Old Testament is that it's a mirror. It's a mirror. You look into the Old Testament and you see yourself. And every obedient nation is Israel, and every disobedient nation is Babylon. Or, depending on the time you're looking at.
Yeah,
You want to be Judah or do you want to be Israel, the northern kingdom, right?
right.
And so the call is let us be as God designed Israel to be, an obedient nation dedicated to him, right? And if we fall away, as you might say we have, then yes, you will become Babylon. It's a choice, right? Do you want to be Cain? Do you want to be Abel? Do you want to be a people that are of the seed of the woman or of the seed of the serpent, right? This is a decision you get to make. And when the early Americans come over, they're saying, we're coming over to build a new Israel, not in the sense that we're special in God's like redemptive plan and the Messiah will come. No, 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 no. It's just we want to be like Israel as God was calling an obedient nation, right? Dedicated to him. So then you come to maybe we are Babylon today, right? You could make that argument.
Yeah.
Maybe we are in Babylon. We are certainly exiles in this sense that spiritually we are citizens of heaven, right? And so in that sense, we're in exile in this world. We're longing for a better country. So what should we do? Well, just look at what God called the exiles to do in Jeremiah and Daniel. The interesting thing, Jeremiah says Okay, you're going into exile in Babylon. What should you do? Seek the welfare of the city. I've never heard a better definition of politics than that, right? Seek the politics comes from the Greek word polis, right? Meaning city. So God tells the people of Israel through the prophet Jeremiah, go be political. What that really meant was do all the things that would make you a good sojourner there. You know, you're having kids, you're building houses, you're contributing to the community, you're an active participant in a positive way. And then who are the examples that we give of the exiles? Well, most of them, you think of Daniel and Rashak, Meshach, and Abednego, what are they? Political counselors to Nebuchadnezzar. And what do? They call Nebuchadnezzar to repentance through their faithfulness and consistent witness to the Lord. And what happens? You have all of these exilic kings, by the witness of these prophets in exile, fleetingly, not perfectly, but they still do it. They promote true religion. Nebuchadnezzar issues a decree about how God is the Lord. Darius issues a decree. Cyrus the Great issues a decree. You have Artaxerxes in Esther, right? Protecting the Jews. So yeah, okay, we're exiles. Great. Go get involved in politics. That's what God said to do if you're in exile.
That's great. Yeah, and it's so funny how it always like if you just do what the reason that comes up is they're trying to promote this kind of I call it pacifism,
Yeah.
just generally, but this kind of like exclusion zone for
Mm,
Christian influence. The irony, the deep, deep irony in it is that if they were successful in living this kind of seek the
mhm.
welfare of the city and being exiles that were influential, then Christianity would be promoted
That's
and
right.
then I think these people would be very upset by this. It's
Yeah.
like they would be very disappointed and they would have to go away because their project has failed. Because I think honestly, some of
Mm,
these people think when they read Exiles and Sojourners, that means the telos, the end goal of Christians in any nation is basically what you see in Egypt with Christians living
yeah.
in dimitude under Islamic rule. And that for them seems to be some kind of ideal. I mean, like, eh, the reason I am both annoyed by it, but also understand it and can break down the logic is because I think I used to think this way.
Yeah,
And
me too.
so, um, what can you help unpack for the listener and differentiate those two visions? Because both
Mm,
those people, let's say like Preston Sprinkle or
mhm,
others who would promote this kind of exilic Babylon is America, America's Babylon idea,
mhm,
would use that Jeremiah verse, promote the welfare of the city, but use it in two radically different ways. The way you're using it would be very different in the end
mhm.
goal. So how would you differentiate even further and heighten that divide between the two visions?
Mm. I think that the correct way to look at it is to remember that the welfare that we're seeking in the city is welfare as God designs it. So this goes into my chapter on love. If you really, really love someone, then you don't let them do things that are bad for them. You do not enable them to live according to their own morality. You don't skirt around. I mean, think about like a parent whose child has cancer, right? And you know, if you take this child through chemotherapy, right, they'll survive, they'll be fine. But the child hates it. And so, but you know, you're not stupid enough to totally uh, get them off of chemo, but you only take them to chemo as often as the child is kind of okay with it. So they don't run the full course and you're trying to compromise and be kind. That's the most unloving thing I've ever heard in my life. You force that child to go through the chemotherapy, however horrible it is, because you will save its life. That's how an exilic people should act. Instead, we get this, well, yes, they need chemo, but like not too often, or let's try and do a lower dose, or maybe, and eventually you just get dead kids.
Right.
That's what happens. So it's a question of whether or not you really believe that the Bible is the full truth, all of it. The way it talks is the way we should talk, not just the soft parts, the hard parts, because it's a God who wants you to live and not die, right? And I think oftentimes we just don't talk that way. We don't think that way. We we take the verse, that says, "Live at peace with all men, so far as it depends on you,"
Yeah.
and we do far too much to make peace with evil.
Yeah, I agree. And this is kind of a bridge to the next question I had about religious liberty. And the way I think of it is like this with kids. I've heard some Christian parents have the idea.
Mhm,
They're so uh, kind of what some might call an idol. This
mhm,
idol of religious liberty is so pervasive where it's
mhm,
like they won't even send their kids, they don't want their kids to have a Christian education. They want their kids to
mhm,
arrive at a knowledge of the truth on their own. They
mm,
want them to go to public school. They want them to, because that's maybe how they were saved. They were saved later in life, and so they feel a certain sense of, this is how God saves people, is they go and they examine all the religions, and so
mhm,
they'll almost give the kid over and
mhm.
neglect their own duties, um, out of a sense of religious liberty. Does that make sense? Have you heard this before?
Yeah, that's a really interesting angle on it, and that does happen. I haven't thought about religious liberty being what's behind that impulse. Yeah, I think the thing to point out is that that's just not what the Bible says,
Right.
you know, right? Uh, the Bible tells fathers to raise their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The Bible doesn't say, "Make sure that your kid's exposed to all the different ideologies so they can make a decision for themselves." Like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Your job as a parent is to, um, shape the environment of your child so that they are more likely to love Jesus. Right? That's the whole job. Your job is not to shape their environment so that it'll be easier for them to make a different choice
Right.
because that choice is bad for them. Imagine that it's like, "Hey, I want my kid to make all his decisions for himself, and we have some rat poison and we have some Flintstone vitamins. I would hate to force either of those 2 on him, so I'm just gonna put them both on the table and see what happens."
Right.
That's functionally what's going on here, and aren't their souls more important than their body, you know? It's like,
Right.
"Hey, let's make sure they have access." And then, there are a lot of pro rat poison Christians out there,
There
so we're
are.
gonna let them hear both sides,
Yeah.
you know? Talk about the value of rat poison and talk about the value of Flintstone vitamins, and, we'll let the kid kind of, pick his own way because that way, he'll really mean it.
It's
That way he'll
insane.
really
It's
makes it's the same reasoning there. Now, don't, you can't try to convert your kid by gunpoint, but what you
right.
can do is construct their environment so the rat poison is locked away and inaccessible to them, and you have a timer where you remind them every night to take their Flintstone vitamin,
Right.
just like anything else in life. Like, we
Yeah.
make this too complicated.
I agree. I agree. Well, with religious liberty, because you did do some great work in the book on this,
Oh, yeah.
and I want to set it up with like this because we've seen in recent years kind of this more assertive Christianity, or at least I
Mhm,
have. I kind of curate
mhm,
my timeline so that I see that stuff,
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
because I find it inspiring. I think they're doing the whole moral principle and application uh, fairly
Yep,
well. So you'll see this in people who confront a demonic statue in
yep.
Iowa. You'll see this in people who oppose the Hindu. Not enough people, but oppose a Hindu statue in Texas. And so I'll say stuff online. One of the
Mhm,
things I recently said was something to the effect of it should be impossible to practice Islam in America.
mm,
And that, for some people, I guess that raised their hackles. First of all, I'm a pastor. Like, I want
mhm,
the promotion of Christianity everywhere, even if
mhm.
you don't feel as like
Yep,
passionate about it.
yep.
Um, but the common question is like, what this gets into issues of religious liberty seemingly very quickly, because it would seem that with
Mhm,
your syllogism and with your thesis,
mhm,
there would be, and these may be boogeyman arguments, but they are out there,
mhm,
like, but you're restricting people's ability to worship freely,
mhm,
because we have this religious liberty clause. It's in that
mhm,
First Amendment. You want to
mhm.
overturn the Constitution. How would
Yep.
you address that in your thesis and syllogism?
Mhm. So there's a legal question here, constitutional law, and there is kind of a practical, prudential, political question, like what's best for us today. Let's do the legal question first. So I love the First Amendment. Think First Amendment's awesome. Let's keep it. Don't change a word. What does the First Amendment say? First Amendment says Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion. Here's the first thing to note. That limits Congress. It does not limit any other part of the government. It does not, in other words, particularly the state legislatures, right? And we know when the First Amendment is passed, numerous states had establishments. Some of them were like hard establishments. There's like a state church in Massachusetts, for example. Virginia. Some of them are medium establishments. So you would have, I think it's North or South Carolina says this is a Protestant state. Doesn't say it's Baptist, Congregationalist, just it's Protestant, right? And then other states that we'd say a soft establishment, where you said, like in Georgia, they said, well, we're not officially a Protestant state, but if you want to serve as a representative, you have to be Protestant. You
Sure.
have kind of religious tests for office. In New Jersey, it's like this too. Pennsylvania, lots of states are like that. And then other ones where no religious tests for office, no state church. This is like New York, but the government still enforces both tables, well, the whole 10 Commandments. They have Sabbath laws, they have blasphemy laws, right? You have no state where it's like, hey, we want this place to be as welcoming to Turks as it is to Englishmen. Nope. These are Christian states. It just depends on how detailed they were or how narrow they were doing it. So all that was going on and was perfectly permissible under the First Amendment because none of that was Congress, two houses of Congress passing a law. That was left up to the states. So it's perfectly fine under the First Amendment. The other thing to realize is that, when these Americans are using the word religion, what the Supreme Court justices like Joseph Story, who are contemporaries, make this very clear. The point there is not to make America equally welcoming to Islam as to Christianity. The point is that you and I wouldn't get into fights. So Congress couldn't decide if all the states are going to be Baptist or Presbyterian.
Right.
That's the point. It's which sect of Protestantism. And the founder said, we're going to be pan-Protestant. If you're Protestant, you're good to go.
Right.
Now, at the time, they still had, you might call it liberty, maybe a better word is toleration for Catholics and Jews, right? You do have a few number of Jews. They were not, persecuted or anything like that. They were doing just fine. Same thing with Catholics. You have some regions like Maryland, for example, where there's more Catholics and not getting persecuted at the time, and that was perfectly compatible. But the idea was that the government would be Protestant. Like
Right.
you guys can do your thing, don't cause any trouble. We're not going to have wars of religion. Let's not fight over that. But you guys do your thing. But we're going to be run like a Protestant country. That's really the constitutional arrangement that we have at the founding and what is encoded in the Bill of Rights. So there's no legal problem at all for the president or Congress to speak well of Christianity, to encourage Christianity, to pass Christian laws. It's just that Congress couldn't create a state church. And even then, states could, perfectly allowed. Eventually, the states say, this isn't really necessary anymore. We're not going to do this. We're not going to have a state church. But the rest, they still keep Christian laws, religious tests for office, all that's still going on into the 19th century. In fact, 7 states today, I think 7 states today, I can't remember, I think it's blasphemy laws. They still have blasphemy laws on the books. And there's lots of regions across the US, they still have blue laws, Sabbath laws.
Yeah.
So all that's perfectly fine with the Constitution. Now then there's the prudential question, okay? You can't make it illegal for someone to believe Islam. The government has no ability to make a law against your beliefs. That's impossible. It's unjust, right? The government can put regulations around what you do. And if there's a religion like Islam that is very detrimental, not only to the religious well-being, but the material well-being of a people, the government absolutely can and should regulate the outward expression of that. How specifically? I don't know. There's lots of different ways. You could be extreme and say, I don't want to see anybody doing a prayer call in public. That'd be pretty extreme, right? The
Right.
other one could just be your mosque can't be downtown.
Right.
Right. And it can only be this big. It can't be too big. Right. So you just kind of zone it. Right. Lots of options there. None of them have to be tyrannical at all, but it is orderly and it is aimed at making it easy to be godly and hard to be sinful.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, and that's the way I try to argue it with people is, like exactly like what you said. If I truly love my neighbor, I don't want them to go to hell, and I don't want them to be tempted by false religion. And so
That's
why,
right.
especially as a Christian pastor, just a Christian man, why would I want the promotion of false religion to
Mhm.
be rampant in society, whether it's
Yeah.
atheistic or Islam?
Here's the thing. Like, even if they're not a Christian, we got to remember that hell burns hotter for people with more heinous sins. Okay. Hell is worse for Hitler right now than your unbelieving old lady who tried her best but didn't rest in Jesus. Right? There are degrees of punishment. So even if for some reason your Muslim, neighbor never comes to know Jesus, if the government has restricted his outward practice of false religion, the government is saving him from a harsher punishment in hell. So we don't only need to be thinking about politics as evangelism, although I'm clearly saying that it should preach, share the gospel. We also need to think it is loving for me to try and restrain your wickedness. This is the civil use of the law, right? The government uses the law to restrain wickedness. And that's good for them, even if they never come to know Jesus. Right? You are saving them from a harsher punishment, and you will have a millstone hung around your neck if you advocated to make it easier for them to cast themselves deeper into the pits of hell. Don't do that to yourself. That's not loving. God hates it. Sorry, I got excited.
That's great. Yeah. So like, if we truly promoted what you're talking about, there would probably not be a Diwali celebration at the White House. I mean, just, off the cuff. Like that probably wouldn't be happening.
I hope not. Yeah, we really had a moment there, didn't we? We had like the Charlie Kirk Memorial, like we're so back, baby, and then just nosedive right into
so bad
demon worship.
That's great. Is there any other? I want to make sure for the listener, things that I'm not thinking of, questions that I'm not asking, like just big hesitations that you anticipate or that people have said with your book that you want to make sure you address to either clarify or help people along in understanding your concepts?
I think the biggest one is this is just not a crazy idea. This is, especially as Americans, we are not asking for anything other than classic American Protestant political theology. We're not here to strip people of their rights. We're not here to, or anything like that. We're talking about how to run America as it was running kind of on default. Like these are just things that we knew and that we did, and then we lost it. And we're seeing a lot of the negative outcomes that come when we forget how to think like George Washington thought, for example. George Washington is so clear in his farewell address. He tells the nation, nothing is more important for the political well-being and the continuation of this republic than religion and morality. That's George Washington, right? The defender of freedom, the father of our nation, right? And we need to recover that and think the same way and say the government has to protect and promote the religion and morality of the people, or our republic will fall.
Amen. That's great. Well, James, where can people get a copy of your book?
Get it on Amazon, King of Kings, Kindle, Audible, paperback. If you want the really nice hardback, you got to go to founders.org. They got a beautiful copy, and follow me on Twitter.
That's great. And what's your Twitter handle?
It's James_D_Baird.
Okay, excellent. I'll put a link to that in the show notes for the listeners. James, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
Well, I think that was a great conversation. We covered a lot of ground with James, and I really hope you'll go check out his book. Link is in the show notes for that. As always, subscribe on YouTube. Smash that subscribe button. Give it a like, give it a comment, all that good stuff over there. Leave it a great rating on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you're listening. And you can keep up with all my work at jchasedavis.com. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your support, and I'll see you next time.